Greg, I just want now everyone out.
Please
No
welcome
noise.
Executive Director of the Aspen Strategy Group, Ambassador Nicholas Burns.
Good morning, everyone in the United States. Good afternoon to all of you in the United Kingdom, and good evening if you're in points beyond. I'm Nick Burns, Executive Director of the Aspen Security Forum. We are delighted this morning to welcome the Foreign Secretary and First Secretary of State of the United Kingdom, Dominic Raab. We also want to welcome our great friend, Ambassador Karen Pierce. After Secretary Raab's remarks, he's going to give a speech on global Britain. He'll then be joined by another great friend of ours, Andrea Mitchell, Chief Foreign Correspondent and Chief Washington Correspondent of NBC News. Dominic Raab is a great friend of the United States. He's most welcome at the Aspen Security Forum this morning. And there's obviously a lot for us to be discussing. With the UK's exit from the European Union and the arrival of President Joe Biden in the White House, this is a unique opportunity for Americans and Brits to reaffirm the long and deep and important special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. The UK, in American eyes, is one of our most important, I would say, vital allies in the world. It's a very dependable and very strong member, of course, of the NATO alliance. The UK government is working very closely with the US to contain Russian power in Eastern Europe, to try to bring some stability to a very unstable Middle East, and to try to bring peace to Afghanistan, where we have been together now, the UK and US, for 20 years. It's also a highly capable and valued partner on a full range of intelligence activities and programs around the world. And the UK is one of the largest trade partners and largest investors in the American economy, and a very important partner on climate change going forward. So our ambition in hosting today's program is to rebuild and renew the special relationship between our countries for the decades ahead. There are also some questions, some open questions that we should discuss this morning. First, we obviously share a common view of the competition we face from an increasingly assertive China in the Indo-Pacific. So how can Britain now join the Quad countries to make sure that we're limiting China's military ambitions in that vast region? Second, today's St. Patrick's Day, so happy St. Patrick's Day to all. There is concern in the United States about the future of peace in Northern Ireland, and specifically about the question of whether Britain's exit from the European Union may lead to a weakening of the Good Friday Agreement. Secretary Raab, I think you know that in our nation of immigrants, there are a few groups as vocal, as united, and active as the Irish American community, of which I am a very proud member. There is tremendous support for the Republic of Ireland and for the Good Friday Agreement in the Congress, in the public, and even, of course, in the White House. And in that light, after you finish speaking, we'll hear from Congressman Brendan Boyle about his views on this central question. Finally, the tragic death of Harry Dunn and the UK's attempt to extradite Anne Sakoulis to the United Kingdom. A question of diplomatic immunity is in play. Can this disagreement be brought to a close by our two governments? Those are some of the questions. There is so much that unites the United States and the United Kingdom. I want to welcome Mr. Secretary, you this morning. And after you speak, you'll have an opportunity to talk to Andrea Mitchell and then to answer questions from our very large audience. The floor is yours. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Nick, great to see you. I'm only sorry I can't be there in person, and happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone out there. I had the great pleasure of meeting with the Irish American Caucus, including Brendan, when I was there last time. You all know that yesterday, the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, published the Integrated Foreign Policy Review, Global Britain in a Competitive Age. And for us, it sets out the UK's international strategy for this decade and beyond. It follows a clear-eyed analysis of our capabilities and the opportunities and the threats that we face in the world today and tomorrow. And our conclusion and my argument today is this: the UK has a central role to play on the world stage as an independent sovereign state, a leading member of the Western Alliance, and an energetic and dependable partner in the growing prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region. And these features of our foreign policy, our independence, our partnerships, our commitment to the East, they're all part of the common mission that is global Britain in the 2020s. And that mission is to be a force for good in the world. A force because, let's not be naive about it, without power, economic, military, diplomatic, cultural clout, we can't do anything. But a force for good because the purpose of this power is to increase people's security and living standards at home in the UK, but also across the world. It is the right thing for a leading power to do, and it's squarely within the interests of the British people. Now, as we look out into the world today, there are three dangerous and dominating trends. The first is the fraying of the world order that grew up after World War II that seems stronger than ever just a generation ago. Democracy is in retreat. This decade, the combined GDP of autocratic regimes is expected to exceed the combined GDP of the world's democracies. Just take a second to think about what that means. Tyranny is richer than freedom. And that matters to us here at home because we know that stable, freedom-respecting democracies are much less likely to go to war, to house terrorists, to trigger large-scale flows of immigration. And democracies are generally, not always, but generally easier to trade with and easier to cooperate with to solve our shared problems. That's the first problem. The second trend is the rise of new threats. Now, we've all become accustomed, we've become used to talking about asymmetric warfare since 9/11. But technology, twisted to perverse causes, is creating dangerous new weapons which fall short of armed conflict. We know this for ourselves. 3 years ago this month, we saw a nerve agent attack on the streets of Salisbury, an attack without a shot being fired. Same time, states, terrorist groups, criminal gangs are exploiting technology to prey on our homes, our businesses, and our infrastructure. The third trend of our times is perhaps the most dangerous, and that's the rise in what we can only consider as potentially at least existential threats. They're the threats to our civilization, threats to large swathes of the world's population, or even threats to our planet itself. We see the nuclear weapons technology proliferating, a very real risk that it could fall into the hands of people who just can't be reasoned with. We face the possibility of catastrophic climate change, catastrophic pandemics. And I think we can all see how COVID has shown just how interconnected we all are in the modern world. And yet at the same time, for all these threats, now isn't a moment to wallow in the council of despair, because there are also equally powerful reasons to feel optimistic about the future, for us in the UK, but also for the world at large. Our fraying international order can be repaired and reinforced. We can counter these new threats, these new challenges, as we've shown during this pandemic, through the collaboration of scientists to innovate new vaccines. Most of all, I believe we should be optimistic because we see that the flame of human freedom still burns brightly, even at the bleakest moments. And you can see that on the streets of Russia, on the streets of Belarus, Myanmar, Hong Kong. Young people risking their lives to stake their claim to the future, demanding democracy, freedom, a better quality of life, telling the old guard in their palatial offices that a different time is coming. And I saw it for myself when I was out in Khartoum in January, and I visited the focal point of the 2019 revolution that forced a transition from power, although not before the security forces killed many young protesters. So I met some of those protesters, including a young woman called Rifka Abdelrahman. And she became known as the tear gas hunter, because every time the security forces hurled tear gas at the protesters, she raced to pick up the canister and she threw it right back at them. She's remarkably brave, and I draw courage from hers. She took some time to talk with me about the hope that she, her friends had, their dreams for the future. And for all the challenges that a country like Sudan faces, it's the hope and the courage of those young people that give that country a fighting chance if it gets the international support that it sorely needs. And there are many other countries like that today. So whilst we've got to recognize that history doesn't march in a straight line, that technology can have a dark side, we must also take heart when the future bends towards freedom. Now, I don't think there's any inevitability to this. There's no end of history. But if we summon the will, if we galvanize those countries that share our core conviction, together we can and we must wrest control of history once again and shape a better path ahead. And I believe Britain has a central driving role to play in all of this. So how well equipped are we in Britain to navigate this dangerous but hopeful world? Well, history offers us at least some clues. First, the UK can lead the world in innovation and technology. We were the cradle of the first industrial revolution, that happy combination of intellectual innovation, private capital, and public infrastructure. Now, obviously, today, instead of Watt's steam engine and the spinning jenny, we've got a proliferation of disruptive technologies, AI, quantum computing, biotechnology, the next great economic step forward. The second lesson is that our strongest asset is our people, and that includes the way we create communities that can come together. After the Great Plague of 1665, it was Daniel Defoe who wrote about "with work suspended for many." People got through by showing great charity towards one another. And I feel that same spirit has marked out our country throughout this pandemic. Our national commitment to the NHS and to carers, a broader spirit of neighbourliness. That's proved a vital source of strength for us, and I think we need to cherish it. But it also marks out our approach to international collaboration, a sense of international civic spirit, if you like. And we need that now more than ever. Now, the third lesson from history is the strength of our institutions, whether it's the Church of England, Parliament, our armed forces. We've just got a knack for creating enduring systems that can serve the public. And perhaps our greatest contribution is the rule of law and the sacred principle, the foundation of order at home and abroad. That's particularly British tradition with a global appeal. Don't just take my word for it. We saw last month the international community elect Karim Khan to be the first British chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, as well as Judge Joanna Corner, a testament to their credentials, but also to the British brand. So institutions matter at home and abroad. And the fourth and final lesson that I draw from our history is the overarching need for global engagement. In the UK, particularly as we've come through Brexit, I'm not shy about saying we're a proud, independent nation, but we're not inward looking. Sovereignty it's never meant isolation. Just look at our commitment to free trade. It reflects a deeply held belief in human exchange as a force for good. And our historic ties with all corners of the world give us a uniquely international perspective. Britain is truly global, and that gives us an edge. So these defining characteristics, a scientific, community-minded, law-abiding, outward-looking people, stand us in really good stead for the challenges of our time. But of course, history doesn't just hand you a blueprint to follow, and many of the threats that we face today are new. So what's Britain's comparative advantage today? Well, put simply, we've got clout. Britain has economic, military, diplomatic, cultural clout. We're the fifth largest economy in the world. The UK is in the top 10 countries for the ease of setting up a business. We've produced the largest number of tech unicorns in Europe. Innovation runs through our DNA. And with less than 1% of the world's population, we're blessed with 6 out of 30 of the top universities, more Nobel Prize winners than any other country outside the US, and 14% of the most cited research. So economic power. And our hard power is pretty potent too. The UK spends more in cash terms than any other NATO member outside the United States. We're the only one of a small number of NATO allies who can bring to bear nuclear, cyber, precision strike weapons, fifth-generation aircraft, surface and underwater capability, alongside an agile maneuver division. And our investment in cutting-edge technology will position the UK as a global leader in cyber and space. And that capacity to project force rests on another key characteristic that I've already mentioned, and that's our tradition of internationalism. And that's where our diplomatic clout comes in, with the 4th largest diplomatic network in the world, reinforced by the 2nd most generous aid budget in the G7 as a percentage of our national income. We've got an unparalleled range of expertise to help resolve conflicts and disputes from Cyprus to Yemen. We're a problem-solving nation. And that gives us influence and it gives us reach. We also have, last but certainly not least, a disproportionate cultural influence. I'm not just talking about the English language, it's what our people do, our artists, our designers, our writers, our sports people. You know, the other day I found my 8-year-old son, Peter, watching YouTube, and he loves Minecraft. I don't really get what it was all about, but he was listening to the British gamer, Dan Middleton, commentating on it. I checked him out. This guy has almost 25 million subscribers around the world. He's not a one-off. We've got the Great British Bake Off. It's watched in 196 countries. Premier League is the most watched football league in the world. That's soccer, not American football. It's not just about viewing figures. It's our message, our appeal that really matters. When boxing's undisputed heavyweight championship of the world is settled, it's going to be between two Brits, Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua. When David Attenborough's latest series goes around the world, it helps shape the global debate on climate, biodiversity, plastic pollution. And it's those qualities, a global reach, a compelling brand anchored in a vision of a better world, that help explain why, according to polling by Ipsos Mori, the UK is the most attractive country for young people in the world. So we've got some strengths. What use should we put them to? Well, I believe that if global Britain means anything, it means our force is meant for good. Yes, we're a world leader in innovation and tech, but we want that innovation to be a force for good. So we lead in the debates on setting down rules and ethical frameworks on human genomics. And we can and we should do it again for AI, for data, and for e-commerce. Last year here in the UK, we introduced a UK Magnitsky sanctions law to target individuals guilty of the most serious human rights abuses abroad. This year, we're going to go one step further and extend that model to corruption, that scourge of the poorest nations. We took the bold step to issue an invitation to this country to the people of Hong Kong oppressed by Beijing. We set an example to the world with our contribution to COVAX, the global vaccine program for the developing world. We're one of the most generous contributors to foreign aid. And we're, of course, the first industrialized nation to set a legally binding national target to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Now, there's a golden thread running through all of this. The UK is not afraid to act, but we prefer to act with others, to form alliances and partnerships that multiply the force, the impact that we would otherwise be able to bring to bear if we acted on our own. More than that, global Britain, our concept is one of a creative disruptor, willing and able to challenge the status quo, but in the cause of good order and future stability. A mold breaker, but also a rule maker, a disruptor for stability, if you like. We've got a buccaneering spirit, but we also strive and yearn to build bridges. The challenge is to make the most of those strengths. That's why we brought our aid budget and development policy together with our diplomatic network in the new Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to drive a more integrated approach to maximize our impact abroad. And in January, I saw what this really means and what it can achieve up close in East Africa, from the UK military support that we provide training Kenyan peacekeepers under AMISOM to defeat al-Shabaab, right the way to the school that I visited in Addis, which we support as part of our campaign to guarantee 12 years of quality education for every girl. And it's that unique combination of our hard power and our soft power that is so often a game changer in those countries that we strive to support in a spirit of partnership. So, with all of this in mind, the integrated review sets out 4 global strategic priorities. First, our starting point, forged in the crucible of this pandemic, is to nurture our capacity for scientific and technological innovation. We must harness our comparative advantage in tech and science to create the better paid jobs of the future at home and to boost exports fueled by liberal free trade. That's key to reinvigorating UK productivity and enhancing the capacity of our startups to scale up. And I think you can already see this being infused and reflected in the Chancellor's most latest budget, from his review of R&D tax credits to the super deduction from business tax bills for capital investment. And our ambition in tech and science will also shape global Britain's Indo-Pacific tilt towards the growth opportunities of the future and the partnerships that we're going to need to grasp them. So it's that USP in tech and science which will also be a defining feature of the second strategic priority, which is a pioneering approach to free trade. That's why the British Trade Secretary Liz Truss has agreed trade deals with 66 countries as well as the EU. And that's why we've launched the UK's negotiations to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, to place a new anchor in a part of the world that will provide the most I believe, the most fertile ground for the expansion of UK manufacturing, UK services, including in areas like digital and data. Of course, there'll be other markets too. We'll look to Africa, particularly the Horn of Africa. We'll look to the Gulf, South America, with renewed ambition, renewed energy. And in Africa, our offer will be grounded in the need to provide a more compelling alternative to some of the less scrupulous governments who exact a punitive long-term price for short-term investments in things like infrastructure. Put very simply, our offer to Africa will be more liberal on free trade than the EU. It will do business with greater integrity than the Chinese or the Russians. And we're committed to serve as a force for good in the communities in which we invest. And we'll do this by combining our trade, our aid, our values to patiently nurture long-term win-win partnerships. And beyond those bilateral trade deals, we've taken up our seat at the WTO under the fresh leadership of the first African, the first female Director General. And we're committed to unblocking the vested interests in protectionism and unleashing the power of global free trade to help the world bounce back stronger and bounce back greener. We also recognize, I think, in the UK, that we've got to change the way that we do business. One of the things that the pandemic showed up very clearly is the weakness of our supply chain model, as every country around the world queued up for PPE and other vital goods from China and a small number of other mass-producing countries. Of course, we embrace the power of the market, we value our trade with China, but we will also develop new partnerships with the existing allies and other high-trust vendors. We'll work with the likes of Estonia and Norway, India and Israel, Singapore, South Korea, and many others, to diversify our supply chains from manufacturing to tech to shore up our economic resilience. Now, our science base and our economic resilience are vital elements of the third strategic priority, which is security. We can do even better in deploying and adapting our lead in science, tech, and research to bolster the defenses of our businesses, our citizens, and our government. Through GCHQ, through the National Cybersecurity Centre, and our partnerships with business, we're a world leader in cybersecurity. And we've got the UK's new National Cyber Force. We're investing to stay ahead of the unholy alliance of hostile states, criminal gangs that prey on our PCs, our tablets, and our iPhones, whether their objective is to steal, spy, or to spread lies. And the integrated review highlights the Janus-facing nature of our investment in tech and science, driving economic productivity and bolstering our security, reinforcing our domestic resilience and demanding more innovative relations with long-standing allies and new partners. And that's why we're increasing our defence spending by £24 billion over the next 4 years. We'll restore Britain's position as the foremost naval power in Europe. We'll modernise our armed forces. We'll be spending £7 billion over the next 4 years in R&D to take a lead in new areas like space, cyber, AI, quantum tech, and directed energy weapons. That far exceeds our NATO pledge. By the way, for all the talk of the Indo-Pacific, our commitment to NATO is absolute, supporting its adaptation to threats both above and below the threshold of conventional warfare. In the same spirit, we'll maintain our nuclear deterrent to counter the most extreme threats to our national security and our way of life. We'll continue to adapt to meet the, frankly, predatory opportunism that we see from Russia, Iran, North Korea, and some others. We'll adapt our defence posture to the new shift in the balance of the world towards the Indo-Pacific region. And you'll be able to see that this year with HMS Queen Elizabeth leading a British and allied task force to the region. And that leads me to the fourth and final strategic priority, which is the defining feature really of global Britain. The IR provides a roadmap guided by our moral compass, our history, and our present day mission as a force for good in the world. From our inventors to our entrepreneurs, from our diplomats and aid experts to our brave armed forces, all the people involved in delivering global Britain share a unifying sense that we're part of a shared planet. We believe that we can and should help alleviate the worst suffering in the world, that we have a moral responsibility, an indivisible stake in our planet, our economy, our global ecosystem, and the broader conditions of peace and stability that underpin them. And frankly, whether or not you share the internationalist impulse, I think we can surely, all of us by now, see the cold, hard evidence compelling us to take a greater interest and responsibility beyond our shores, whether it's Daesh to the plastic pollution in our oceans, from COVID to the threat of climate change. I don't think it's ever been plainer that the UK's raw national interest is inextricably bound up in tackling the international challenges that touch us all, the challenges that will define the security, the livelihoods, the happiness of our children and their children after them. And that's the key to global Britain. We do it because it's the right thing to do, but also because bitter experience shows us that strengthening fragile countries and their people is essential to reduce the terrorist threat we face, to reduce the migratory flows that arrive in the UK. We feel a moral reflex to exploit our scientific base, not just to vaccinate our own people from COVID, but also to take a lead internationally to make sure there's equitable access to the vaccines for the most vulnerable countries. It chimes with our sense of justice. But we also know that this global pandemic requires a global solution, that we won't be safe until we're all safe. And that will be a major theme of our G7 presidency this year. This year is a big year for us. We will also be leading on climate change as we bring the world together in Glasgow in November for the COP26 UN conference. And I have to say that with the US rejoining the Paris Agreement, with many other countries stepping up to the plate, Japan, South Korea stretching their emissions reduction targets, we sense an opportunity to shift the dial on climate change, phasing out coal and boosting climate finance. And let's also be honest, none of that's going to be possible without at least some constructive cooperation with China. So we take this challenge on out of a sense of social responsibility in the world. But I think we also see now more than ever the tangible impact climate change is having. In all of these different areas, global Britain is imbued with a sense of responsibility and a desire to help. But we also see the direct gains that we can yield if we can reduce tensions between allies, resolve global problems, bring stability to regions whose prosperity will contribute to our own. And I think that's important. Foreign policy, certainly for the UK, it has to stay grounded in the real life concerns and the interests that our citizens have, whether it's securing the decision by the latest job-creating business to headquarter in Britain, or defending ourselves against the threat from terrorists radicalizing the vulnerable online. But it just so happens that many British people also count amongst those very tangible interests, the values they hold dear. They expect their government to stand up for freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. Because it's in our DNA, because it's our compact with the world. And this is not just about the content of one or other set of international rules, it's the very concept to which we feel compelled. We see our maritime interest from fishing to navigation reflected in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We identify with those countries lining the South China Sea whose legitimate claims have come under recent threat from China. That's not a regional issue, it's not even just a maritime one. If the terms of a lawmaking international treaty bearing the signature of 168 state parties can just be junked on a whim, it's not just an attack on one or other article or of one or other treaty. It's a wholesale assault on the system. Now, I don't know, perhaps it was inevitable after the Cold War with the economic rise of many developing countries, a good thing, that we'd see a rebalancing of global power, that this would translate into pressure to change the international rules. And yet those governments seeking to ransack the international system remain a minority, albeit a dangerous one. And I think that's why the Biden administration's return to the Paris Agreement, the US's return to the WHO sends such a powerful message. Because none of us can afford a vacuum in the multilateral institutions where international law is shaped, negotiated, and ultimately decided. Nor can we in the West afford the disunity, whether it's holding Iran to its nuclear commitments, holding Russia to account for the use of Novichok, or holding China to its freely assumed international human rights obligations. So we must redouble our efforts to reinforce transatlantic solidarity. But I think the really urgent imperative that we face today is to broaden that consensus in favor of an international system that respects open economies, open societies, and promotes public goods. If we're going to rise to the global challenges of COVID and climate change, if we're going to safeguard the international order that reflects a set of progressive liberal values that serve so many of our goals and our interests, We're going to need a concerted effort to bridge the old dividing lines between the West and the G77, the global North, the global South. So let me be clear about it. The UK will remain anchored in NATO, in Five Eyes, a close US ally, a friend of the Gulf, a dependable European neighbour and partner, a passionate member of the Commonwealth. But global Britain will also be able and willing to forge to follow agile clusters with like-minded countries where our values and our interests demand it. That's why you can see under our presidency of the G7 that we've invited India, South Korea, and Australia to join this year's summit. Because we in the West, we've got to broaden our reach and our appeal if we're going to tackle those global challenges and manage the threats that we face today. Now that's just a start. It's an organic one, if you like, building on the traditional G7 format. But it's part of, and it must be part of, a conscious broadening of the caucus of nations who feel committed to reforming, but also safeguarding an order grounded in rules and a conception of the common good. Now, these are just the core tenets that will guide global Britain for the coming decade, but they're crucial. A focus on science and tech, yes, to make Britain richer, but also to help the world develop good ethics around AI, genomics, the internet. A commitment to free trade, to create British jobs, but also to offer the developing world a more compelling model of economic growth and debt servitude. Clear commitment, an unequivocal commitment to security, to defend the British people, but also to help build up better governance in countries abroad. And an absolute commitment to be a force for good in the world, to help the global South, but also to expand British interests. And let me finish with a pledge. It was the US Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, who described foreign policy in the post-war era as being like being present at the creation of a new world. Well, I believe that we bear an equally humbling responsibility today. So today, the British government undertakes to work with our allies to do whatever it takes to make that new world a better one for all of our people and for the planet itself. Because if these islands, if this rainy archipelago off the European coast has a particular destiny, it's surely to act as a beacon of hope at home and abroad, to fight for peace and prosperity, to defeat the enemies of mankind, and to act as a force for good. That's our mission. That's our promise. Thank you very much.
Secretary Raab, thank you so much for that expansive speech, an optimistic speech about the evocation of a global Britain, which we very much welcome here in the United States. Secretary Raab is going to take his seat. Now let me welcome my friend, Andrea Mitchell, Chief Washington Correspondent for NBC News, Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent, host of Andrea Mitchell Reports, and NBC is the official media partner of the Aspen Security Forum. So Andrea, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Nick Burns. Thanks to all of our colleagues at Aspen and all of you watching today. And very great thanks to the Foreign Secretary, of course, for presenting his view of a global Britain here today and for giving me this opportunity to ask you questions. Mr. Secretary, on to that point, you've talked about reaching out to Asia as part of a global Britain, reaching out to China as well. Now, just this week, our secretaries, Blinken and Austin, have talked of China's activities as being coercive and aggressive in so many ways, not just human rights and, of course, Hong Kong, but Taiwan, Tibet, the Uyghurs. So in all of these warnings to China coming from our secretaries on their first visit together to Asia, in Japan and South Korea this week, how do you calibrate your new approach to China, given the US warnings that China has been so aggressive and coercive regarding all of the Asian countries with whom we share values?
Well, Andrew, it's great to see you again. Sorry, I can't be there in person, but look, I think you said it, you framed it exactly right. We need a calibrated approach, and we certainly heed all of the counsel of our American and our Indo-Pacific friends. I think the way we look at it is like this: China is here to stay. We don't believe that we're harking back to an old Cold War mentality or paradigm. There are positives, and we ought to look for the areas of constructive engagement. Obviously, business and trade, everyone is more or less doing trade with China. There are other areas. We're hosting COP26, as I mentioned, and we're not going to shift the dial on climate change unless we can engage in some kind of cooperation with China. At the same time, we're absolutely resolute about standing up robustly and rigorously where British interests are affected, whether it's intellectual property or critical national infrastructure, and standing up for our values. And you've, I think, seen that with the lead we've taken on Hong Kong and also diplomatically on Xinjiang.
Now, let me ask you about Russia. Of course, the President of the United States has now confirmed that he is going to take action, that he actually warned Vladimir Putin that there would be action, would be retaliation for what the US intelligence has now said was Russia's aggressive meddling in our election through an influence campaign ordered by Vladimir Putin himself through proxies here in the United States who were close to President Trump to try to defeat Mr. Trump, rather to re-elect Mr. Trump and defeat Joe Biden, to undermine Joe Biden's credibility by impugning his integrity and his family's integrity with false conspiracy theories. So with this warning that there will soon be retaliation against Russia, and he also confirmed that he had said that Vladimir Putin is a killer, this just today coming from the President of the United States. How do you deal with Vladimir Putin in this context?
We certainly share many of those concerns. We stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends, and we've seen the nefarious actions of President Putin and Russia in Libya and Syria. We've seen it on UK soil. We've seen both a Novichok attack in 2018 on the streets of Salisbury. No one would have ever thought we could see a chemical weapons attack on the streets of the UK from a P5 member of the Security Council. We've also seen more recently attempts by Russian groups to target through cyber attacks research on the vaccines. This is clearly outlandish behavior. And I think we need to be very clear-eyed about it. We need to apply costs where Russia's behavior breaches all international norms. And we need to also be able to incentivize better behavior and a willingness to engage where Russia does improve its behavior. But there's not a great sign, not great signs for optimism at the moment.
There's also, of course, concern about North Korea. And now in the first communications that we've had now from North Korea, from Kim Jong-un's sister, she has warned against joint US-South Korean military exercises resuming, saying that it will create a great stink, a warning of reaction. This is the first threat that we've heard, the first response we've had from North Korea, actually diplomatically, in more than a year. How do you consider the North Korean threat? Do you see this as a global threat to the UK as well?
I think we view the threat of a nuclear power like North Korea. We see the regional instability, not just on the military front, but the fragility internally in relation to North Korea. We obviously support not just the US, but our Korean and wider allies in the region. Ultimately, we would like to see a diplomatic resolution. We fully support that, but I think it's right that that's done from a position of strength, and we support the US in that.
Do you still believe that the US goal of having a denuclearized peninsula is realistic, given the advances and the report from the Pentagon now that they have at least 3 long-range missiles capable of reaching the continental United States?
Well, I'm not a technical military man, but one of the themes of the speech today is that, yes, technology has got a dark side, but we've also got the capacity to innovate and find new ways to meet those challenges. So I would have thought that with diplomatic will, and that's really what we need, political will from Pyongyang, there'll be a way to find a route back from North Korea out of pariah status into something more acceptable. And let's face it, a better path for the North Korean people. So I certainly think that there's still scope for a diplomatic resolution, but it's got to be one that meets our proliferation concerns.
In the new global posture announced by the Prime Minister and explained by you today, you're talking about a reduction in the nuclear arsenal in Great Britain. Should there be concerns among your allies that you're reducing by a very large percent the nuclear arsenal in the UK?
I think the criticism we've had have been the other way. We've said we're going to maintain our minimum.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry. I was thinking about the reduction in your troop posture from 100,000, which had been what the US had said. What I'm talking about here is the increase in your nuclear arsenal by some 40%, which is considered, which has been criticized both in your country and by people in ours who are interested in nuclear reductions, which you have done for 20 years.
Absolutely. And we've always said, even as we were reducing our capability, our stockpile, that we needed to maintain a minimum credible deterrence. That's been our strategic priority for countless years. And what we're doing is maintaining continuity with that. But given our stocks and given the diversifying threat that we face, I think undoubtedly, we're making sure we can maintain that minimum credible deterrent. And I think it's important. We want to see a nuclear-free world, but as we've just discussed, I don't think it's going to happen by unilaterally giving up the ultimate insurance policy that we need and we respect that the US needs.
We're going into the NATO meetings next week in Brussels with your country and ours and all of the other NATO allies. What is your understanding of what we should be doing in Afghanistan? Here you're talking about troop reductions. Would that also include a decision regarding Afghanistan? As you know, President Biden is wrestling with the decision as to whether to live up to former President Trump's decision to withdraw by May 1st, which a lot of people, including the military here in the US, believe would be precipitous. We've got 2,500 troops for the counterterrorism operation in Afghanistan. NATO has 5,000. What would a US withdrawal by May 1st mean for the NATO commitment? Would you have to also withdraw?
So first of all, you mentioned troop numbers. We are investing £24 billion in our defence and our security. Of course, we'll adapt it to the threats that we face. But this is a significant and substantial strategic boost to our military and security capability. In relation to Afghanistan, I think when we talk about the diplomacy and what's going on the ground, we ought to just keep our eyes on what the strategic prize is. We do never want to see Afghanistan becoming a place that can be a safe haven for Al-Qaeda or similar Daesh or any other terrorist group. And I think from the UK's point of view, we don't want to lose any of the gains that we've made. But ultimately, what we want to get to is a position where the Afghan security forces can give us that reassurance. So the military means and the number of troops that we have is a means to that strategic end. And ultimately, we'll not get to that strategic end unless we can harness the security forces in Afghanistan being bolstered, but also diplomatic understanding with the authorities in Afghanistan. And that will require talking to, in the way that has already taken place, the Taliban.
But those goals could not be achieved by May 1st. Would it be unrealistic that many people are warning that would lead to a civil war, a collapse of the Kabul government?
I think it's important that we get this right and that we, again, keep our eyes on the strategic goal rather than work to one or other deadlines. Otherwise, we may end up, the risk is we end up back there in 10 years' time if we don't make sure that we leave on a sustainable basis.
I want to ask you about Iran because Europe has led the way. The European three and the UK principally also has led the way in trying to get back to diplomacy with Iran. They've broken out, as you know, in response to the US unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA. They've broken out considerably from the nuclear agreement, from the constraints. How do you see, with Europe's lead, and of course with the UK, getting the United States and Iran back on track?
But look, first of all, we welcome the administration's commitment to JCPOA or JCPOA plus. One of the things, notwithstanding all the haggle on Brexit that we've been having with our European friends, one of the things we always did, and I did with my European partners, particularly the French and the Germans and Joseph Borrell, is keep talking. We met regularly in the UK. I've been out to Paris, Berlin, and most recently we got together in Paris with a virtual meeting with Tony Blinken. And I think, and it's a theme that I mentioned in my speech, we've got to keep the transatlantic alliance together. We've got to stop giving adversaries like Iran or other adversaries around the world, the gift of tensions or differences between us. I think that's incredibly important. And I think one of the things that we've, on all sides, recommitted to is that solidarity. And of course, our strategic goal with Iran is it must never acquire a nuclear weapon. We think that the JCPOA, enhanced, reinforced, expanded if necessary, is the best means to achieve it. It will have to be through some sort of diplomatic negotiated agreement. We need to hold Iran to its existing commitments, but also work with it to get it back around the negotiating table. So we'll work with our European partners, of course, with our American friends, to hold Iran to account, to make sure it never gets a nuclear weapon. But I think ultimately, realistically, that's going to have to come via diplomacy.
Does there have to be some, some lifting of sanctions before we can get Iran to comply and stop processing at the level it is now?
I think Iran's got to live up to its existing commitments, but the reality is actually what we should have now is a return to diplomacy without preconditions. And I know the US is committed to that, and I've understood that the Iranians were, and of course there's different voices in the regime in Tehran, but that's what's necessary. And I can see it squarely in the interest, of course, of the international community that's worried about Iran, but it's also in Iran's interest. So we will keep pressing, keep coaxing, cajoling, but also holding to account Iran. And I remain stubbornly optimistic, notwithstanding Iran's behavior, that there is a route through.
And finally, on this St. Patrick's Day, I wanted to ask you about prospects for resolving the trade disputes with Brussels over Northern Ireland. There has been a joint resolution now proposed in the US Senate. There's bipartisan support to block any unilateral trade agreement between the UK and the US if there's anything that would upset the Good Friday Accords. Can you reassure American political figures and Americans that that is inviolate?
Every time I've been out to the US, I've met with Richie Neal and the Irish American Caucus. I met with Brendan, who I know is up asking a question in a moment. We understand the US's commitment to the Good Friday Agreement. Of course, our argument has always been that it is the EU, by trying to erect a barrier down the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, that is the one challenging both the Northern Ireland Protocol, the spirit of it, but also the Good Friday Agreement. We're absolutely committed to making the Northern Ireland Protocol work. But what we're not going to do is see the integrity of the United Kingdom put at risk, which would be obviously something that we would take incredibly seriously, but also would jeopardize the Good Friday Agreement. But the key thing is, and every time I've been to the US, we've either had an up or down in the Brexit soap opera, if you like. And I think the key thing is we've got this free trade deal with the EU, and that gives us a legally binding arrangement. It also gives us the joint committee with the Northern Ireland Protocol, where the two sides can work together. Let's take the heat out of that, and let's resolve it on a pragmatic basis. But we also need the EU and those on the other side of this negotiation to live up to their commitments, not to put at risk the integrity of the single market between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and that of itself underpins the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, I want to thank you for letting us participate with you. It's always a great pleasure to see you, Foreign Secretary, and for all that you are doing to advance our relations.
Thank you.
Andrea, thank you very much for being with us, as always. Secretary Raab, we now have people who would like to ask some questions, beginning with someone you know well, a friend of mine, Congressman Brendan Boyle of the 2nd District in Pennsylvania. Congressman, I think you're with us.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
We sure can. Yeah.
All right. I think after 12 months, we're used to saying that now and taking ourselves off mute, but it's good to see you, Nick, and thanks for the invitation. And Dominic, it's very good to see you again, albeit virtually. Dominic is no stranger to Capitol Hill and has certainly had, as he mentioned, extensive conversations with a group of us. This is actually perfect timing because obviously my question follows up with what Andrea was talking about. As you know, 2 years ago, I accompanied the Speaker of the House and about 10 of my colleagues to 10 Downing Street when we met not with you, but the previous British government to express our concern in the US that while we completely respected and supported the right of the British public to decide whether or not the UK would remain a part of the European Union. That's not our place to get involved in. We wanted to make sure that in doing so, there was no violation of the Good Friday Agreement, either intentionally or more likely by accident, essentially collateral damage. And so I'm glad to hear again, your reassurance on that. But obviously the concern remains because after 4 years, as you know, of tortuous negotiation between the UK and the EU, you achieved at the Northern Ireland Protocol. And yet twice now, the UK has taken unilateral actions with respect to delaying that protocol. So is this government still committed to it? Are you confident that this latest unilateral action is just a delay? Or are we going to continue to be in this cycle, which obviously can be destructive? Thank you.
Brendan, great to see you, and look forward to seeing you again on the Hill when travel is possible. Look, thanks for being able to engage constructively on this. Look, you're right. We're still wrestling with the Northern Ireland Protocol and trying to make it work. We need to make it work in the interest of all the communities in Northern Ireland on all sides. And of course, all that we've ever done is take targeted precautionary measures that are necessary to respect and to uphold the integrity of the United Kingdom, and in particular, the internal market between Northern Ireland and mainland Britain. And I would just say, I don't want to get you sucked into a tit for tat, but I hope that our friends on the Hill on all sides of the House and both houses are equally robust in picking up when the EU undermines the agreement, in particular the invocation of Article 16, because that was something that created huge tensions, not just in one community, but across all communities, because of the risk to trade from Protestant, but also to Catholic communities between Northern Ireland and Britain. So we just want to make this work. We want to be innovative. We want to be pragmatic. We want all the communities there to be able to live prosperously and with peace and stability. And I think the most overt political threat to the agreement, and ultimately the Good Friday Agreement, has been the politicized way that the EU has gone about things. And I mean, so much so that Dublin was very critical when Article 16 was cited in that way. So we welcome your engagement. We know that you've got a huge stake in peace in Northern Ireland, and we're absolutely committed not just to the Good Friday Agreement, but also to making the Northern Ireland Protocol work. And just to remind you, we have said unconditionally, absolutely, we would never see any infrastructure erected at the border between Northern Ireland and the South. I think it's a good question whether the EU has made such a similar, unequivocal and absolute commitment.
Congressman Boyle, thank you very much for your question and being with us. Foreign Secretary, we have two journalists now to ask questions. First, James Landale of the BBC. Second, David Sanger of the New York Times. We'll take them sequentially. James.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon. Secretary of State, two quick questions. One is the integrated review did not say a great deal about Britain's future security relationship with the European Union. Can you tell us what you think that relationship should be? And secondly, now that the British Prime Minister has made it very clear that the cut in Britain's aid budget is temporary, it's exceptional, and it will not require legislation. It will be made under the existing legislative provision. Can you tell us when that cut will be reversed? Can you confirm that it will be taken back to 0.7 of GNI in the next financial year? Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Good to see you. Look, we can't give you a commitment on time because of the inherently unpredictable nature of COVID's impact on the public finances, but we want to get back to it just as soon as fiscal conditions allow. I think you may be slightly overinterpreting what the PM said in the House yesterday. We'll obviously comply with both the international and domestic legal commitments that we've got. And let's just remember for a second, we are still proportionate to GDP, the second biggest aid donor in the world, in the G7. We are giving £10 billion next year. I understand that people have different views, either for or against, but for a country that's gone through an economic contraction the size of which we've not seen in 300 years. We've got double the budget deficit we faced during the financial crash. This is just an exceptional measure that we feel that we've got to take. You asked about European security. We're absolutely committed to European security, and that's why and I said in my speech today, we're absolutely committed to NATO. Indeed, we've got a £24 billion commitment to our defence and security budget, well outside the NATO target. And the last visit I did last week was to Estonia and Norway to meet with the Baltic 3 and the Nordic 5, because we understand the importance of working with them to strengthen European security, particularly given those threats to Russia that we just described.
James, thank you very much. Foreign Secretary, we'll now go to David Sanger of the New York Times.
Thank you, Nick, and Mr. Secretary, good to see you again. Thanks very much for joining us today. I had two questions that came out of your speech. In your description of the increase in your nuclear arsenal, you characterized it as a moment to increase or better your deterrent. But of course, Britain is under the same requirement that other members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty are, which is to move toward a zero nuclear force. And I'm wondering what the Iranians and others will say as they see the increase. I was also wondering, in your section where you were discussing Russia, it's clear that our method of sanctioning the Russians for these activities that you described isn't working, right? We're continuing to see chemical weapons attacks, in one case against Mr. Navalny. We're continuing to see cyber attacks. Does that suggest to you that we need a different approach to deterrence with Russia on this? And what would that be?
Yes, thanks very much. Just to be clear, we didn't say that we were increasing our nuclear capacity. We said we would increase the stockpiles to maintain a minimum credible deterrence, which is strategically continuity and consistent with all of our international obligations. On Iran, look, I think it's an interesting question. I actually think that the sanctions have had an impact, but they're clearly not going to shift strategically the position in Tehran, or they haven't to date. We think that we need to hold Iran to account. We need to apply cost when they behave badly, but we also need to keep the diplomatic door ajar for a negotiated settlement, which is the only way I can see that we'll have an enduring set of commitments that we can rely on in relation to nuclear proliferation in Tehran.
And the sanctions on Russia, that was what I had asked you about. And clearly the Navalny case suggests they're still using their chemical weapons. The most recent Solar Winds case suggests we haven't deterred them in cyber. What do you need to do differently?
Well, in relation to Moscow, I think Russia, amongst others, have taken advantage of the world's attention being distracted by COVID. We've seen that in all of the instances that you described. And I think we need to be very clear. Again, it's the same with all hostile states, whether it's the menacing behavior from Russia or Iran, as we've just described. I think we need to apply accountability and costs where they behave badly. And I think with Novichok, we ought to be open to further sanctions, given the seriousness of what we've seen. It's not just a one-off offense. It's if you like, it's a repeat of what we saw in 2018. We saw in Salisbury, and the world galvanized around that. And I think we need to send a very clear message. We need to do so as Europeans, as Americans, but we need to also do it to uphold the international rule of law. This is not just a human rights violation in relation to Alexei Navalny. It's also, I think, a breach of obligations at the OPCW. So we need to hold Russia to account. We need to apply a cost to this appalling behavior. And again, we also need to show that there's a better path diplomatically if Russia gets its act together and starts behaving as any responsible member of the international community would and should.
David, thank you very, very much. Secretary Raab, we have one final questioner, and it's former member of Congress, Jane Harman. She's a member of our Aspen Strategy Group. Jane.
Good morning, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Nick, I've got on the right color. My question is on the rise of right-wing populism in Europe, in Western Europe. From what I read, Macron is a little bit weaker. The Le Pen party is rising. In Germany, Merkel is leaving in September, and at least 2 regions of Germany have had some victories of right-wing white supremacist neo-Nazi parties. I wonder how this affects Britain's dealings with Europe, but also whether this is happening in Britain and how that will affect the wonderful sketch you made of how Britain is reaching out to the world and reaching out to the US.
Well, look, there are always tensions, and we take a zero tolerance to any extremism, from wherever it comes from, right or left, or whatever its cause. The reality is, in terms of right-wing extremism, we keep a very close eye on it. But we've seen the parties to the right of centre-right parties like the Conservative Party pretty much out of business. And one of the reasons is, I think, when it comes to tackling the narrative, you need to take into account the reasonable gripes and causes that some of those extremists grapple onto. So I hope I set out a liberal, value-based vision for global Britain. But at the same time, we said, as we came out of the EU, we need to take back control over our immigration system. Why? Because I'm the son of a Czech refugee and my wife's from Brazil, right? I couldn't be more internationalist. We've got migrants all around the cabinet table in the UK. We've got an internationalist outlook from Priti Patel, our Home Secretary, to Rishi Sunak, our Chancellor. But I think if you're going to have public confidence in your immigration system, you've got to be able to control it. I think if you deal with those reasonable issues, you find at least some of the extremists, not the white supremacists, I'm not saying that, you'll still see them at the fringes, in the darkness, if you like, but you'll take them out of your mainstream politics. We don't have the British National Party, the BNP, in UK politics. We've seen the other so-called right-wing parties have effectively vanished, not vanished in terms of operating at the margins, but as a force in British politics. And so I think it is an important thing to say, and we saw this in the referendum, that you've got to be able to listen to the reasonable views that popular opinion latches onto. And if people feel that they're being systematically ignored, you tend to fuel those parties at the fringe. And that's really important, that you don't go down that track.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Foreign Secretary, thank you. Thank you for your speech on a global Britain. Thank you for answering our questions. Thank you for being such a good friend to the United States of America. And we look forward to welcoming you to Aspen, Colorado in the summer. It's a very nice place for the next Aspen Security Forum, and all best to you in the work ahead.
Thank you, Nick. Great to see you.
Thanks so much. And thanks all for being with us this morning. We appreciate it very much. Thanks, Foreign Secretary.